A reading from the New Testament, Paul's letter to the Ephesians. The gifts Christ gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into the one who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
A few weeks ago, Liam and I, at our weekly Tuesday meeting, I reminded him, you need to write something for the annual report. And he said, I'm kind of having a tough time because I'm either making lists or I'm writing platitudes. So we talked about that, right? And it led to a larger conversation about reflection on his ministry and his tenure here as our Director of Children, Youth, and Family Ministries. And then we get Ephesians. And I thought, gosh, Liam, you've been a prophet, you've been an evangelist, you've been pastoral, and you've been a teacher. And so I invited Liam to speak today, to reflect on his leadership here, on his ministry, and not have to write a list or say a platitude. So Liam, thank you for saying yes, and let me bring your stand over, and you need a mic. There you go.
Using my high-tech notes here. So, a couple of weeks ago, Vic asked if I would consider speaking today. And at first I was like, well, maybe this is going to be a low attendance Sunday, like sometimes Grandpa mentions when he's asked to speak. Turns out, it's not a low attendance Sunday. So, thank you all for being here, for listening to what I have to share. So, since Vic got back from her sabbatical over the summer, I've been thinking about that sign that we made for her to welcome her back. And it used the age-old metaphor of a pastor like a shepherd and the congregation like her flock. And that got me thinking, like, okay, if Vic is a shepherd, what does that make me, right? I think a sheepdog, right? I've been shaggy enough to look the part for the past couple weeks, and it kind of fit. You know, I do a lot of running around corralling. So I'm like, okay, who else might fit in this world? What other characters could we build out? Well, okay. Sheep make wool, wool has to go somewhere, right? So maybe the wool that we all make is the raw sounds that we produce when we sing, and Melanie and Michelle are wonderful, skilled wool dyers and spinners who color what we do, right? John could be an incredible weaver who weaves together the voices of the choir and the other instruments to create a beautiful tapestry for us all to enjoy, right? All right, let's see, who does that leave? Jacob and Yelma, right? I think Jacob could be a trusted and reliable workhorse. He just cranks it out. Week in, week out, we depend on him, right? And Yelma, we might not think of what he does, but he comes through every week to take care of this building when we're not here. We don't even notice him. I was thinking he could be like the rain that washes the field clean after the sheep have come through and grazed, right? So that's my metaphor, trying to extend it out a bit further. I got to thinking that each of us is practicing our own form of ministry, right? Each of us is required for this entire community to function properly. So I'd like to take this time to reflect with you on the arc of my ministry here. I started as the Director of Children, Youth, and Family Ministries on August 16th, 2021. It's been 895 days since I began my tenure. That's nearly 2.5 years. When I took the job, it was almost exactly 20 months since I had graduated from Macalester College and began my job search, and 17 months after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I know in many ways those months were absolutely brutal for all of us. For me personally, on the one hand, I moved in with my amazing partner, Lily. It was a wonderful and joyful time. And on the other hand, it was shockingly painful because my beloved Grandma Marge died suddenly of a heart attack in July of 2021, or in July of 2020. So all of this was on my mind in 2021 when I was on my way back from the Boundary Waters and I was in Grand Marais, Minnesota. And I got a call from Victoria. And she said, I hadn't talked to her for a while, so we spent some time catching up and it was lovely. And then eventually she got to this question, hey, would you consider applying for a job? I was like, well, I don't know. I've never really considered ministry as a viable career path for myself. But I don't know. I was flattered, but probably not. I said, hey, my friend Ben Petty would be excellent at this job. Well, here we are over 900 days later, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do ministry. Right? But I've learned a lot. So here is some of the ways that I've learned since beginning my role, and some of the ways I've tried to practice ministry here. First, I took a class at United Theological Seminary. I audited a class on faith formation, and that was really helpful to just kind of get the basics of what is this field about. Vic also had me read several books. One by Marcus Borg, there we go, Marcus Borg, and the other by Emily Heath. Now, I liked Borg's book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, much better than Emily Heath's book, Glorify. I found it much easier to settle into Borg's ideas of Jesus as a spirit person and a revolutionary. That resonated deeply with me. However, Emily Heath uses this idea that one of the reasons mainline Protestant Christianity is in decline is because of a lack of discipleship. We need to be more vigorous disciples. We need to glorify the kingdom of heaven. Now, I'm often very uncomfortable with Lord, kingdom language. I find it creates a weird power differential. But when Vic passed around this basket of words earlier this year, we all pulled out a word, I raced from downstairs up here to get a word. And I was one of the last words grabbed. The star. The words on the star, yeah. And my word was discipleship. So I realized I probably had to give this another shot. But it kind of got me thinking about all of the various things that at first I was like, no, and later have warmed up to. And that has kind of been a theme in some of the areas of focus of my ministry. In particular, thinking about the Lord's Prayer, right? The Lord's Prayer is an absolutely central piece of what we do here. We say it every week, right? I had to memorize it in 3rd grade, and I've remembered it ever since. But again, it uses that Lord language that I'm a little uncomfortable with. And so when I was part of when I started working with Elijah Carroll at St. Paul's UCC, he mentioned to me that St. Paul's uses a different version of the Lord's Prayer that uses the term eternal spirit instead of the Lord. And that version of the Lord's Prayer, the eternal spirit prayer, has resonated with me very deeply. And I would say that has kind of been the center point of my theology since I encountered it. It has also informed just my reading in general. Books I've enjoyed reading recently in particular, or one in particular stands out. It's called The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I don't know if any of you have heard of it before, but it had huge airplay during early months of the pandemic. I believe it came out in 2020. And it takes a hard look at climate change and what a world dealing with the effects of rampant climate change might look like. It's a scary book, and it's also an inspiring book. I would highly recommend it to any of you who are interested in learning more about what a warming planet would look like. Now, I don't want to ruin it for you, but religion plays a huge role in the book. In fact, people become a sort of disciples for sustainable living. And it's a key part of how they deal with managing the systems of the world as they come under more and more strain. One of the things they find is that we can't continue living in a world of rampant inequality. And so one of the things they focus on is how do we get everybody's basic needs met? And Robinson identifies 7 core needs. So I'm going to read this quote. The necessities are food, water, shelter, clothing, electricity, healthcare, and education. All these are human rights. All are public goods. All are never to be subjected to appropriation, exploitation, and profit. It's as simple as that. So, if that is what ministry for the future might be, I've been wondering what my ministry for the future could be. And I think I've tried to develop my ministry around 3 things in particular. The first is the ideal of home and the necessity for shelter. The second is full spectrum human sexuality education and advocacy. And the third is ecological alignment. How do we live in right relationship with the world? So to pull those apart, start with the first thread, housing. One night in April, when I was 13, I slept in a church parking lot in a cardboard box during a sleet storm and shivered. It was for a fundraiser to raise awareness for youth homelessness in Minnesota, called Night on the Street. At some point during the night, my box collapsed on me, and when I crawled out, everyone else was gone. It was the first year they had ever opened the church building, the Plymouth church building that we were staying in their parking lot, to let people warm up overnight. And our youth director at the time was Lori Elford, and she had left to take all of the other kids home who had gotten too cold throughout the night. But Ruth Ann Arney had stayed to keep me company and watch over me. It just so happens that I had timed crawling out of the box with when she went to get coffee. So we ended up bailing on the worship service that morning, and I went home, took a long hot shower, and went to bed. That was an absolutely eye-opening experience. I got to go home, right? I went back to Night on the Street 4 more times, eventually took my younger brother and friends with me, and each year they brought in a different speaker, or at least one speaker who had personally experienced homelessness at some point. One woman in particular stands out to me. She was a poet, and she used the simple phrase, "If home is where your heart is, then I guess I'm heartless." If home is where your heart is, then I guess I'm heartless. That haunting line and the other stories that were shared drove me to learn more about housing and homelessness throughout college. In many ways, it was the primary area of study for me across all 4 years of school. I wrote my very first final sociology paper about it my freshman year. I took as many classes as I could about cities and the built environment. I interned in the Minnesota House of Representatives with Alice Hausman, the former rep for this very church and the former chair of the Housing, Finance, and Policy Committee. And I wrote my final capstone paper about that experience and how we fund housing aid in Minnesota, as well as the roadblocks we face politically to doing it better. So when I took this job, I hoped maybe I could do something related to housing at some point. So I jumped at the opportunity when Elijah Carroll from St. Paul's UCC called me and asked, would I consider collaborating with him and other UCC churches in conjunction with an organization called Settled to do something housing related. He said he had the previous year helped build a build a greenhouse for a tiny house village with the Mayflower Youth Group. So he was like, okay, maybe we could raise some funds towards a tiny house. And I said, let's build a whole tiny house. And he said, whoa, slow your roll. Well, it took a ton of work, but thanks to all of you and the other 3 congregations, we did it. Vulcan Heights UCC, St. Paul's UCC, New Brighton UCC, and St. Anthony Park UCC raised $35,000 and donated it to Settled. In conjunction with the fundraiser, we had 5 workshops talking about housing and homelessness in Minnesota, letting the students learn more about what that entailed. And then later, we spent half a dozen Sunday afternoons working to build the tiny house with our own hands. It really felt like a full circle moment. It was incredible to feel like I had actually gotten to do something in the fight against homelessness. I hope it was very meaningful for some of the youth as well. Now, some exciting news that I've shared briefly with some of you before, but the Minnesota legislature has since changed our state laws to accommodate sacred settlements on houses of faith's property. So now, anywhere in the state of Minnesota, if a house of faith has property, they can build a tiny house village to help house people. Unfortunately, there is still an absolutely massive need. Way back in 2019, even before COVID, we needed $1 billion worth of investment in our current housing stock in the state to make it safe, and $1 billion worth of investment in new housing stock, just to keep pace with demand across a 10-year window. Current funding levels are just over half of that. So the need is getting worse. I have 2 talks, a Housing 101 and a Housing 202, that I'd love to share with anybody who's interested in learning more about housing. I don't have time to go into it now. So, housing, thread 1. Thread 2, sexuality. When I was a preteen, I absolutely hated the health unit in PE. I, in fact, tried to get my mom to get me out of it at one point. She said, absolutely not. She also told me that I was eventually going to be doing sex ed at church, something called OWL, and I was mortified. I did not want to do it. But then I was part of the very first OWL cohort here at this church. It was, again, led by Lori Alford, and I got totally hooked. I had a blast. It was very empowering, and it was just fun. It was enjoyable to talk about this thing that I had never really been exposed to talking about openly before. I mean, my parents had certainly tried, but I might have been a little obstinate. Well, several years later, I was a senior in college, and Kat asked me to come to the church and help volunteer to lead the next OWL cohort. So that was then the 4th OWL cohort. So I was involved in the 1st and the 4th, and now I've had the privilege of leading the 5th and the 6th OWL cohorts as well, and the very first young adult OWL cohort here at the church. So just to give you an idea of the size of this program over the past decade plus. Total, we have now graduated 38 students from the OWL program. By the middle of this year, we will have graduated, hopefully, 18 more. That means that over 50 people have gotten to learn about sex and sexuality, knowing they are loved no matter who they are. So, supportive, full-spectrum human sexuality education through OWL. It's probably one of the things that day in, day out, week to week, I spend more of my time doing than anything else. So, 3rd thread, living in alignment with the natural world. This is deeply intertwined with ecology and other natural sciences. And it also got me thinking about where did I develop this love of nature and the living world. When I was little, I spent Mondays with my Grandma Marge, pretty much every Monday. In every spring, we would go to the garden store together and pick out flowers for her garden. I would get to pick out a few packs of my own for a flower box reserved specifically for me. Eventually, my brother Luke got his own flower box as well. And every year, for years and years, those 2 flower boxes would sit on the edge of my grandma's patio and bloom. And I loved showing them to my mom and dad and anybody else who would come by. And Grandma would always say, "That's Liam's box," right? It gave me a sense of pride and ownership over that little corner of the natural world. Now, my grandma wasn't like the most creative or innovative gardener, but she was, and she also had pretty bad arthritis in her knees by the time I was born. However, she was very methodical and caring and took time to explain what we were doing and why. I believe that helped foster a deep sense of connectedness to nature. My favorite books growing up were about kids running off to live in the woods with animals, like My Side of the Mountain, Sign of the Beaver. Eventually, I started camping and canoeing in the Boundary Waters and found many folks here who also deeply love that place, including a man named Gary Clemens, who is no longer here with us, but who imparted a huge amount of wisdom to me about the Boundary Waters. So the other location, the church really helped push me to enjoy wild spaces was during family camp at Pilgrim Point. I spent most of a week running around outside with other kids of the UCC, and we enjoyed ourselves greatly. So now that I'm in the DCYFM role, I've tried to recreate parts of that through our all-ages camping trips to William O'Brien State Park and Lake Maria State Park over the last 2 years. But I've also been trying to pull more elements of ecology into our curriculum, specifically the Breakfast Club curriculum. But we restarted our worm composting bin downstairs in the basement. And we now also have a place where we can plant plants in the downstairs so they can overwinter. I would highly encourage any of you to check it out. It's the old 345 classroom off the dining room. And I've asked the students every day when we come in to gather, how do we take care of these plants? How do we take care of these worms? And I don't know if it's sticking, but I hope this interest in living things, this interest in care resonates with them as well. So our Breakfast Club curriculum is now working their way through a new curriculum about water stewardship and creation care. I hope that this curriculum will build to a meaningful, multi-part, hands-on experience, just like the settled cohort did. I hope that we will plant many native species, maybe here at our church, as well as perhaps at Falcon Heights UCC, and maybe other locations if we can find them. These native species will help to make our ecosystem more vibrant and resilient in the years to come. So, there you have it. One sheepdog's take on how to do ministry for the future. I've tried to prioritize spiritual development through the goals of universal housing, inclusive sexuality, and ecological sustainability. So I ask you, how do you choose to go forth into the world and do your own ministry for the future? How will you choose to be disciples of living in right relationship with God, the eternal Spirit? Amen.